I'm John, and welcome to Plane Crashed, the channel where we uncover the most unforgettable moments in aviation history, the stories that changed the skies forever. Tonight, we dive into the heart-stopping ordeal of Qantas Flight 32, a flight that pushed human skill, engineering, and courage to their absolute limits. What was meant to be a routine journey from Singapore to Sydney turned into a chilling fight for survival at 30,000 feet. When an explosion ripped through one of the world's most advanced aircraft, the Airbus A380. This is not just a story of failure, but of precision, teamwork, and an extraordinary triumph against all odds. The morning of November 4th, 2010, began like any other day for the crew of Qantas Flight 32, the world's largest passenger aircraft. An Airbus A380 stood gleaming in the tropical light at Singapore's Changi Airport, its white fuselage reflecting the sunrise as engineers performed the final checks. For Captain Richard de Crespigny, a veteran pilot with decades of flying experience, it was a routine leg to Sydney, a journey he had completed countless times. But beneath the calm hum of the airport and the steady rhythm of passengers boarding, fate was quietly preparing to test every ounce of human skill, engineering integrity, and composure imaginable. As 469 people settled into their seats, none could have foreseen that they were moments away from one of the most dramatic incidents in modern aviation history. At 9:56 a.m., the engines roared to life, four massive Rolls-Royce Trent 900s generating enough thrust to lift the 560-ton giant into the sky. The takeoff roll was smooth, powerful, and seemingly flawless. Within minutes, Flight 32 climbed through the humid Singapore air, banking gently toward the open expanse of the South China Sea. Inside the cockpit, everything appeared normal until suddenly, without warning, a deafening explosion shattered the tranquility. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, the cockpit filled with warning chimes and flashing lights. Passengers heard a loud bang, followed by silence, then the smell of burning oil and smoke filtering through the cabin vents. Some thought an engine had burst, others whispered that a bird strike might have caused it. But what had actually occurred was far worse. A catastrophic, uncontained failure of the number 2 engine, one of the enormous turbofans mounted under the left wing. In a split second, shards of titanium and debris shot out like shrapnel from a bomb, slicing through the wing and fuselage. The engine disintegrated, and fragments ripped through electrical wiring, punctured the fuel tanks, and destroyed hydraulic systems that controlled vital parts of the plane. The damage was unlike anything seen before on an Airbus A380 in flight. Inside the cockpit, chaos erupted as more than 21 separate system warnings blared simultaneously. Red and amber alerts lit up the screens, each one representing a different failure. Fuel leaks, hydraulic pressure loss, electrical faults, flight control malfunctions, and even engine fire indications. The sophisticated computer systems designed to manage emergencies were overwhelmed. It was a scene that no simulator could fully replicate, a moment that separated instinct from panic, leadership from fear. Yet in the midst of the electronic storm, Captain de Crespigny's voice remained calm, deliberate, and steady. He and his crew, First Officer Matt Hicks, Second Officer Harry Woburn, and 2 Czech captains, David Evans and Mark Johnson, fell into a rhythm honed by years of discipline and training. They had been trained for emergencies, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the scale of damage unfolding before their eyes. The engine that had exploded was gone, but the destruction it left behind had crippled the aircraft's nervous system. Fuel poured from a hole in the wing, critical sensors went offline, and parts of the flight control surfaces no longer responded. The pilots quickly realized that the A380, a marvel of engineering built to withstand extreme scenarios, had become wounded in ways even its designers had never envisioned. Yet despite everything, it was still flying. As the aircraft leveled out at around 7,400 feet, Captain de Crespigny took manual control, using every ounce of his experience to stabilize the giant. He and his crew began the systematic process of diagnosing the failures. The electronic centralized aircraft monitor, known as ECAM, flashed message after message, each demanding attention. Normally, in an emergency, pilots might have to respond to 1 or 2 system alerts. Flight 32 presented them with more than 100. The challenge was no longer just about flying. It was about prioritizing life over logic, action over instinct. Every button pressed, every switch toggled, had to be carefully weighed, because the wrong decision could trigger a chain reaction. As the crew worked, the cabin crew and passengers had little idea of the true gravity of the situation. Through the windows, some passengers saw the shredded engine and the gaping holes along the wing. Others noticed a trail of white vapor streaming behind them, fuel leaking into the open air. In the galley, flight attendants whispered urgent updates to one another, trying to maintain composure for the sake of those seated around them. At 10:03 a.m., the pilots declared a mayday, notifying air traffic control that they had suffered an engine failure and multiple system malfunctions. The voice that came through the radio was controlled and professional, but beneath it lay the weight of a near-impossible challenge, returning a crippled, heavily damaged aircraft safely to the ground. The control tower at Changi immediately cleared the airspace, preparing for an emergency return. But the pilots knew they couldn't simply turn back. They had to dump fuel first, as the aircraft was far too heavy to land safely. Yet with multiple fuel system failures, even that became a dangerous puzzle. The ECAM warned of asymmetrical fuel flow, indicating that the left and right wings were unbalanced. The crew manually reconfigured valves to transfer fuel and reduce the risk of instability. They were fighting not just to land, but to keep the aircraft airborne long enough to attempt it. Each minute that passed felt like an hour. The crew worked through checklists while simultaneously hand-flying the world's largest airliner, something rarely done, even in training. The Airbus's computers usually assisted with stability, but with so many systems damaged, much of that automation was gone. The pilots had to rely on raw skill and coordination. Outside, the tropical sky shimmered with heat. The crippled engine continued to smoke, and fuel leaked steadily from the damaged wing. In the cabin, passengers sat in tense silence, some praying, others gripping their armrests. Despite the fear, there was no panic thanks to the calm and professionalism of the cabin crew, who moved quietly through the aisles, checking seat belts and reassuring passengers. In the cockpit, Captain de Crespigny continued to wrestle with the damaged aircraft, while First Officer Hicks and the check captains worked through the avalanche of alerts. They realized the landing gear hydraulics were compromised, and that one of the braking systems was unresponsive. The left wing, riddled with shrapnel holes, had lost part of its fuel management system, and the slats used to slow the aircraft on approach were partially inoperative. Even more concerning, one of the engines refused to shut down despite multiple commands. The explosion had jammed its control lines, meaning they would have to land with a live engine still running, a serious fire hazard upon touchdown. As if that weren't enough, the crew discovered that the engine's debris had damaged the engine pylon, weakening its structural integrity. Any sudden movement or impact could cause it to break loose entirely. It was a scenario so severe that it defied simulation. And yet the crew didn't lose focus. They distributed tasks efficiently. Captain de Crespigny concentrated on flying, while the others managed systems and checklists. Communication remained clear and professional, every command verified and confirmed. At one point, de Crespigny turned to his team and said, "No one's going to die today. We'll get this plane down safely." Those words, spoken with conviction, anchored everyone in the room. On the ground, Qantas engineers and Airbus experts monitored the situation remotely, trying to assist. But there was little they could do. The pilots were on their own, relying on instinct, training, and each other. For nearly 2 hours, they analyzed, recalculated, and improvised solutions. The A380 remained a wounded giant, its strength and redundancy keeping it alive long enough for its crew to fight for control. Finally, after dumping as much fuel as possible and running through dozens of checklists, they prepared for landing. The air traffic controllers cleared the runway, and emergency services lined up in anticipation. Inside the cabin, the passengers were told to brace for impact. Few understood how critical the next few minutes would be. The descent began, slow and controlled, but the aircraft's handling was unstable. The damaged systems made it sluggish and unpredictable. As they approached the runway, alarms continued to sound. Warnings for fuel imbalance, hydraulic pressure, and fire risks. Captain de Crespigny guided the giant aircraft with surgical precision, keeping it steady through sheer concentration. Every adjustment to the throttle, every turn of the yoke had to be perfect. When the wheels finally touched the ground, the impact was heavy but controlled. The aircraft roared down the runway, smoke billowing from its damaged brakes. One engine refused to shut down, continuing to spin even after the plane had stopped. Fire crews rushed in, surrounding the aircraft as passengers looked out at flashing lights and foam being sprayed across the tarmac. Inside the cockpit, the crew remained composed, shutting down systems manually and ensuring no fire spread through the leaking fuel. It was over. Against all odds, Qantas Flight 32 had survived a failure that could have easily claimed hundreds of lives. The scale of the damage was later found to be almost beyond comprehension. Over 500 wires severed, 21 major systems compromised, and holes ripped through vital parts of the aircraft. Yet not a single life was lost. For investigators and engineers, it became a case study in both mechanical failure and human excellence. For the passengers, it was a miracle. And for the world, it was proof that sometimes, even in the face of overwhelming disaster, calm minds and skilled hands can turn tragedy into triumph. As Qantas Flight 32 circled above Singapore's shimmering skyline, the crew knew that every second counted, every decision could decide the difference between life and death. The Airbus A380, once a symbol of modern engineering perfection, was now a wounded leviathan, its left wing torn open by shrapnel, hydraulic systems crippled, and vital instruments failing one by one. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard de Crespigny and his team had already been fighting chaos for over an hour, performing calculations that would have taxed even the most advanced computers. They had run checklist after checklist, trying to stabilize a machine that no longer followed the rules it was built on. The challenge now was to bring it down safely, to land a 560-ton aircraft crippled by multiple failures with nearly 500 souls on board. But it was not as simple as descending toward the runway. The aircraft was far too heavy to land. The landing gear systems were compromised, and there was a very real danger that a single wrong move could ignite a catastrophic fire upon touchdown. Every system on the flight deck displayed warnings. The left wing, riddled with holes, was leaking fuel uncontrollably. The onboard computers reported engine number 1 was still running even after multiple shutdown commands. The aircraft's hydraulic circuits, responsible for controlling brakes and landing gear, had been severely damaged, meaning the crew might have only partial control over the wheels once they hit the ground. Inside the cabin, passengers remained unaware of the full extent of the crisis. Though the sight outside their windows told a story, words couldn't. Streams of white fuel vapor trailing from the wing, scorched metal along the engine mounts, and smoke staining the once pristine paintwork. Some whispered prayers, others clutched the hands of loved ones. Yet throughout the chaos, the cabin crew kept their composure, quietly moving through the aisles, reassuring passengers and preparing for an emergency landing they themselves knew might not end safely. Back in the cockpit, de Crespigny and his team faced an impossible equation. The A380's massive weight, over 440 tons even after burning fuel, was far beyond the maximum landing limit. Under normal circumstances, pilots would dump fuel until they reached a safe weight, but with the fuel jettison system damaged, this was no longer possible. Landing overweight could cause the landing gear to collapse or the brakes to fail, sending the aircraft skidding off the runway in a fireball. Yet staying airborne too long increased the risk of the remaining engines overheating or the fuel leak igniting. The pilots were caught in a race against time, balancing physics and fate. They decided to hold the aircraft in a wide racetrack pattern above Singapore, running manual calculations with pen and paper to estimate how much fuel had burned naturally, reducing their weight just enough to attempt a landing. Each pass over the city was nerve-wracking. The crew could see the blue waters of the Singapore Strait below, knowing that if things went wrong, their only option might be to ditch the massive jet into the sea, a near-impossible maneuver for an aircraft of that size. On the ground, emergency services were mobilized. Fire trucks, ambulances and rescue vehicles lined the runways, sirens ready, crews briefed on the worst-case scenario. The world's media had already picked up whispers of a Qantas emergency, and aviation enthusiasts around the globe began tracking the flight's looping pattern online. But inside that cockpit, time slowed. The crew continued cross-checking systems, testing the brakes, and attempting to shut down the rogue engine. When they realized the engine was still producing thrust despite being manually isolated, a chilling possibility emerged. If it couldn't be shut down even after landing, it could ignite leaking fuel or blow debris across the runway. Still, de Crespigny stayed calm. His voice remained steady as he briefed his team. Every move was deliberate, calculated, and confirmed twice over. He instructed his co-pilot to plan for a long, gentle descent, no sudden turns, no abrupt drops. The A380's flight controls were unbalanced, and any aggressive input could push the wounded plane beyond recovery. Below them, Changi Airport's runway 20C was cleared of all traffic. The tower granted them priority landing, and every emergency crew on site braced for impact. As the A380 began its final approach, tension filled the air. The passengers were told to brace for landing, and in the galley, flight attendants took their seats, heads bowed, some whispering quiet prayers. The aircraft's weight, the imbalance of the wings, and the uncertain condition of the landing gear created a deadly combination. If even one landing strut failed, the aircraft could veer off the runway or collapse entirely. As the massive jet descended through the humid air, the cockpit was filled with alarms and synthetic voices calling out warnings. Hydraulic pressure low, brake temperature high, fuel imbalance, engine fire risk. But de Crespigny blocked out the noise, his eyes locked on the runway through the haze. The final seconds were pure instinct. The aircraft crossed the threshold of the runway at a slightly higher speed than usual, the flaps partially extended, the slats damaged but still functioning. The touchdown was firm, heavier than any normal landing, but controlled. The landing gear groaned under the impact, the tires screamed, and smoke rose as the brakes fought to slow the enormous machine. The reverse thrust, normally a crucial part of stopping such a massive jet, was only partially available. Still, the aircraft remained straight, steady, and true. Fire trucks chased alongside as the A380 thundered down the runway, its brakes glowing red-hot. Finally, after an agonizing 45 seconds, the aircraft came to a halt, just barely, at the far end of the runway. The pilots exhaled in unison. They had done it. But the danger was far from over. The engine that refused to shut down was still running, pumping hot exhaust dangerously close to leaking fuel. If it ignited, the resulting explosion could engulf the entire aircraft in flames. The pilots tried every possible method to cut off its fuel supply, including manually closing valves and circuit breakers, but nothing worked. Emergency crews surrounded the plane, hoses ready, foam cannons aimed. Inside the cabin, passengers peered out their windows at the flashing lights and swirling smoke. The cockpit smelled faintly of burning oil and electrical heat. Finally, through a combination of mechanical isolation and engine cooling, the spinning fan blades began to slow. The engine powered down. Silence filled the aircraft for the first time in 2.5 hours. Then a ripple of emotion spread through the cabin. Tears, applause, disbelief. The passengers had no idea just how close they had come to disaster. The pilots remained professional, keeping systems monitored and communicating with ground engineers. They didn't evacuate immediately, knowing that activating slides near a hot engine or leaking fuel could be catastrophic. Instead, they waited until the situation was stable. then calmly guided passengers to disembark using air stairs. On the tarmac, people embraced, cried, and stared up at the towering aircraft that had carried them back from the edge of death. When investigators later examined the damage, they were stunned. The engine explosion had sent shrapnel through over 500 wires and punctured fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Debris had narrowly missed the cabin pressurization system. One fragment even tore through the wing's main spar, the structure that held the aircraft together. The fact that the plane stayed airborne at all was a miracle of engineering and human resilience. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau later concluded that the cause of the explosion was an oil fire inside the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engine, caused by a manufacturing defect in a single oil pipe, a tiny flaw that nearly led to catastrophe. The event triggered a global recall and inspection of all similar engines, grounding several aircraft until they could be safely cleared. But beyond the technical reports and engineering fixes, what truly stood out was the extraordinary performance of the crew. Captain de Crespigny and his team had faced a situation no simulator had ever prepared them for: 21 major system failures, uncontrollable fuel leaks, hydraulic loss, and electrical damage, and yet they had stayed composed, analytical, and precise. Aviation experts hailed it as one of the finest examples of crew resource management in history. The teamwork, communication, and leadership on that flight became a case study taught in flight schools around the world. Passengers later recounted how calm the pilots' voices had been, how reassuring the cabin crew remained, and how, even in the face of mortal danger, the sense of professionalism never wavered. Qantas Flight 32 became more than an incident. It became a symbol of how discipline and composure can turn potential tragedy into triumph. For Qantas, the event reaffirmed its long-standing reputation for safety. Not a single life was lost, and despite the aircraft suffering damage so severe that repairs were deemed impossible, it was a victory for aviation as a whole. The Airbus A380 had proven its strength, its design redundancy, and its ability to protect those aboard even under unimaginable stress. But above all, it was a testament to human judgment, to the steady hands and calm minds that refused to surrender to fear. As the passengers were escorted through Changi Airport later that day, many still trembling, they looked back through the terminal windows at the massive aircraft resting silently on the tarmac. Its wing blackened, its engine torn apart. They realized that the men and women in that cockpit had not just saved a plane. They had saved families, futures, and countless lives that would never forget that morning. In the days that followed, Captain de Crespigny became a reluctant hero, though he always credited his crew and the aircraft itself. "We were tested beyond anything imaginable," he said in later interviews, "but we trusted the machine, and we trusted each other." That trust between man and machine, between training and instinct, was what carried Qantas Flight 32 through the storm and safely home. In the aftermath of Qantas Flight 32, the world of aviation was reminded that even in an age of cutting-edge technology, it is the human element that ultimately determines survival. What began as an ordinary flight became a masterclass in courage, precision, and leadership under fire. The crew's unwavering composure turned a near-certain disaster into one of aviation's greatest success stories, proving that training, teamwork, and calm decision-making can triumph over chaos. Long after the smoke cleared and the engines fell silent, the legacy of Flight 32 endured, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to what happens when professionalism and humanity soar together against impossible odds.